Hey everyone, welcome to Open Door Philosophy. I am one of your hosts, Mr. Parsons.
I am the second host, Andrew.
No, never second Andrew, never second, you are first. And welcome to episode 94, where we're looking at the second part of our series on the self. We're going to be looking at early modern interpretations of the self. Isn't that exciting?
And
But
again,
anyway.
very selfish focus.
Oh, yes, indeed. How are you, Andrew?
I'm doing great. Right now I'm looking, I wish I could show you. I guess I could. I'll show you after. Fall is a thing I've learned in other places, and so the weather has changed along with some tree colors. And so right now I'm enjoying that outside my window, which is, it's nice. You know, I think people tend to overhype this. They say, oh, the weather is changing. The colors are changing. It's very pretty. It's nice. It's not everything. Mm-hmm. It's much nicer to have nice weather, I think. So other than that, things are going, no complaints here.
Good.
How about you?
Well, I'll complain. So as we're recording this, it's the 26th of October, and today's high is 89. So
it's beautiful. I love that.
I'm waiting for autumn. Not that Houston has autumn, really. It kind of goes from just hot to kind of gross, wet, gray stuff for
That's
a couple
right.
months.
Houston weather waiting for fall is like that, you know, that play Waiting for Godot where it just
like
never shows up. It's kind of like
That's
that.
right. That's right. At least the lows are in the 60s, you know. So
that's nice. I like that kind of weather. I like that kind of weather. If it was a little bit cooler, then that would be nice.
I'd be happy with like a high of 78. But anyway, I'm fine. Let's see. What's going on in my life? Nothing really to report. After we record this podcast, I'll watch my beloved Swans take on Millwall. And I haven't watched them in a couple of weeks, so that'll be nice. And then after that, I'm going down into the city and going to pick up my daughter, and we're going to go to a museum, and then go take her to an English pub.
Wow.
That's in quotation marks because we're in Houston. It's close to Montrose. It's the Red Lion.
Okay. Yeah.
It's been there forever.
Yeah.
But there was another one that closed down. It was the Black Lab or Black Labrador.
That one's by University of St. Thomas.
Yes. It's very sad when they closed that. It had been there for like 40 years. Anyway, but yeah. Other than that, come on, cool weather, and go Swans! Yay museums!
Well, last thing before we move on, this could potentially be our last podcast episode, and what? I say that potentially because. We don't. This is our last. No, I'm not. Just wait. I'm not quitting. But this is our last podcast. It will come out, I think, after the election, but it's always potential. So, as a timestamp, we don't know what the future will be.
As a place in history, let's see. Let's look. Yes,
it's 9 days away.
Yeah, that's right. Or the next podcast. Away. I don't know about next time we record, but the next podcast that drops after this one will be after the election.
Ooh.
Yes, we'll be in a wildly different world. Or maybe not.
Maybe not.
Who knows? I voted yesterday.
Did you? Was it long lines? I've heard it's really long lines.
We got there, I guess, at a good time, although it was Friday afternoon, which I wouldn't think that would be a good time, but no, it took us like maybe 10 minutes.
Okay, that's not bad.
But the volunteer I was speaking with, she said that week, early voting started on Monday. She says that week they have had 12,000 people vote at that location.
My goodness.
That's great. Yeah, there were lines. We got lucky. Yeah, I have a lot of friends who live in the county to the north of us, and they said their lines were like an hour long.
That's what I've heard. So that's great. It's good. It's always good for people to vote.
Make your voice heard. I guess this comes out before. Here, we'll do it. All right, everyone, get out there and vote.
Yeah,
we'll be the vote people. Get up. We'll be those vote people. Get out there.
Will
and vote.
This come out on the election day?
No, it'll come out. It'll come out a week before the election.
Okay. We didn't get lucky this year. Maybe in 4 more years it'll come out on Election day.
Will we be doing this podcast in 4 more years? It's a very good question.
But there's just too much to talk about. So
There is too much to talk about. I mean, everyone should be very disappointed that they missed quite the conversation between Andrew and I about coffee.
that's right. That's right. Let us know if you want us to have that our next episode.
Let's have a coffee episode. All right. Well, yes, I am. My coffee is about done. You know what's interesting is we're recording this podcast at about the same time that I actually teach one of my classes, which is at 8 o'clock. And it's a much different 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning than it is on a Thursday morning or whatever. So we'll see if I can bring the energy today. I'm like, there's no difference. It's still 8 o'clock. We'll see. We'll see. Okay. Here we go. Let's do it.
Let's get started.
All right. The self. You're one, or are you? So, last episode, we began our investigation, or look at what the self is when it comes to philosophy. We say terms all the time, like when we use the word myself all the time to refer to, well, yourself. The question is, what is that thing? Last episode, we differentiated between what the self is versus, say, identity. Identity is the maintenance of yourself over time, how you maintain that self, given that everything constantly changes. But the self is the topic, philosophical topic about the self is like, what exactly is that thing that we're attempting to maintain over time?
In the last episode, we covered from the ancient Greek conceptions of the self to what would we call that time period? That's not the early modern time period, but it's
No.
early medieval time period, I would say,
Yeah.
with Augustine. And what we focus on primarily with these three thinkers is the idea that the self was a kind of soul that exists within us. And we talked about how each of these thinkers viewed this soul, and perhaps Aristotle would think of it more like the mind than someone like Augustine or Plato, but maybe not. What we really took away from that was two things. First is that this was a distinct part of us and was not, well, it was a distinct part of us that was separated from our body, although maybe not totally disconnected from some, but was a separate part of our physical bodies, which we'll see will change later today. The second point, it was the soul's relationship, especially with Plato and Augustine, the soul's relationship with the forms in Plato's case, and God with thinking of Augustine. What we'll see is that will change how the self is connected with other things and how it gets its properties. That will change even with thinkers who consider the self to be a separate and distinct part of itself. And I think that will probably better reflect this Aristotelian conception of the self that we saw, that it has separate and distinct properties. It could be connected with something else, but is probably just born out perhaps more of our identities and things of this sort. So we'll see less of this Platonic and Augustine tied to some greater form in more of an individualized self, perhaps.
And the concept of the self being a soul really doesn't go away in modern and late modern, but what the conception of the self is certainly does change. And this idea of consciousness, which is not really something that the ancient Greeks talked about, especially like the philosophical conception of consciousness. The soul was consciousness, and the soul was the self, and the soul is immortal. And so we will see this shift when we talk about our early modern guys today, Descartes and Rene Descartes and David Hume. So I kind of want to like track this trajectory that the ancients, which is also by extension medieval, believe that the self is a soul and the soul is immortal. And I don't want to, dismiss medieval. Sorry, all our medievalist listeners out there. it's far too simplistic to just say, and the medievals thought the same thing as the ancients. Medieval philosophy is very complex, and of course, differing conceptions of the soul. But what we can say, at least in Europe, across Jewish, Christian, and Islamic lines, is that they did believe that humans had a soul and that the soul was immortal. So it does, in a sense, continue. That conception does continue from ancient to medieval. So those are our first two time periods. And now we'll look at, I'm calling it early modern. The modern
That's right.
period, I mean, I feel like the late modern. So when I say early modern, I'm talking roughly 16th century to
That's right.
18th century, and then 19th and 20th centuries is quite distinct
That's right.
from.
Let me say something before we jump in. Something which we both highlighted in our last episode was I asked everyone to track how a community or society thought about the self and how these societies thought about individuals in their
Mm,
societies as a whole. That's something to keep in mind throughout this episode. In the past, because of how medieval and ancients thought about the self, since it was immortal and perhaps may have been in differing ways, has different properties, but all in all still might reflect something like God or a form, individuals in the society were thought of perhaps as more connected to one another. In the sense, we can think of the everyone having a specific job that they needed to do. Everyone was connected in order for society as a whole to flourish. There was more hierarchy with a natural king who was supposed to rule.
mm,
Individuals and peasants, they were at perhaps the bottom of society, but still played a largely important role for their society's thriving. What we'll see today is a radical shift in this thinking. And so, although this episode thinks about the self perhaps in a more individual basis, we can also think about how a society thinks about itself as a larger reflection of how the society thinks about the soul or the self with its individuals.
yeah, that's an interesting point. You're right. Like, I don't know when we can track exactly when this shift begins in the early modern period. I'm sure it would be an easy thing to point towards Descartes
Yes,
because of his separation of mind and body. And you can also think of like individuals' separation, since, well, we'll get into this with Descartes, but since the mind is separate from the body, I'm sure we can associate that with society, where now the individual is separate from the whole. That's kind of what you were getting at, right?
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, okay, let's talk about our boy Descartes. You know, we haven't talked about Descartes in a while.
We talked about him on our third or fourth episode
Oh,
and then
yeah.
haven't mentioned him yet, right?
I think it was our third episode.
That's
You know,
wild.
go back and listen to that, people, and you'll say, wow, these guys were terrible at podcasting back then. But I'm sure it
That's
wasn't
right.
that bad.
It
That's
was,
right. That's
it was
right.
bad.
But and you know, you're also probably thinking, well, geez, they're not very good at it right now either. But
We try.
gotta have a little self-deprecating humor. Where was I? Only one was saying, oh yes, Descartes. Yes, we haven't talked about Descartes, and sometimes I'm sure over the last 4 years he pops up occasionally in a mention in an episode or something like that. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with Rene Descartes, he is considered the founder of modern philosophy. So cool. Why is that?
I'm not sure exactly why, but every historian of philosophy that I can think of that I've read does point to Descartes as this fine line in the sand between old ways of thinking and new ways of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I think we will come to understand that better today. It probably is because of this radical shift in thinking about the self, who the self is. I think it's a shift from we to I, which we'll see
Mm-hmm.
today. Although I don't know if he necessarily is the person who finally divides that line in the ground. And I don't think that's what his intention was. It's just what happened. The philosophers after him added another
Hmm.
layer in the sand at that point, and so they really did build upon him. So I think that's probably why. But do you have any reasons to think that's so?
Well, his method that he uses to separate the mind from the body, and we get to this conception of an I, like a capital I, is
Yes,
due to his radical skepticism of his senses. And I think that's one of the big shifts, right? He doubts. And the ability to be skeptical, the ability to doubt things was, I think, something very new, especially in the way that he went about it. And so from here on out, we'll see Hume, who's also quite skeptical. There's a lack of trust in certain things. For Descartes, it was the senses, but this, aside from separating mind from body, which is massive in philosophy, of course, Descartes sort of makes it okay to doubt things that weren't doubted before.
that's a really interesting point that you make. I don't know why this is the case, but there are a lot of ancient philosophers, especially in Rome. Those are the ones that come to mind where the skeptical tradition does die off.
Mm-hmm.
We know this because of our previous episode before we started this series. I think when we were talking a lot about Socrates, Socrates was the one to claim to know nothing. That's the ultimate skeptic there.
Right.
And we can see this tradition. We haven't talked about it, I don't think, in any of our episodes too much, but we can see this tradition continue through ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and we see it die off in probably from Augustine. He has this great article that I think a lot of historians think is the death of skepticism, called "Against the Academics,"
Mm.
which is where I think a lot of people see that it kind of starts to die off. But eventually, a lot of writings do come back around the time of Descartes. When was Descartes in operation? 15.
16th century.
Okay, in the early 15, in the late 1500s. This is a quick history lesson. We find a lot of old skeptical texts, which renews an interest in skepticism, which is pretty interesting. So these are probably corresponding somewhat together in time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a brief, I mean, Descartes, he's a Catholic thinker, and there's a lot of Catholic thinkers who are dealing with this renewed tradition of skepticism at this time. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's a really good point that you make. And so that's a brief history of skepticism. And
Yeah.
maybe if you, yeah, go ahead.
So the skepticism, I don't know if the term allows is the right term, but this skepticism allows people to begin questioning all kinds of things. So this is why we begin questioning things such as absolute monarchy in terms of a way of government. And it's when we begin to question things like the geocentric theory of the universe, that the universe revolves around the earth rather than the sun. We begin to question these things in science and in politics that were kind of off limit before then. Well, I don't know if they were like off limit. Well, maybe they were off limit. You might get executed or excommunicated or something like that. So anyway, that's probably enough on skepticism. But this is the shift, right? And why we call the modern era the modern era. And Descartes was one of the earliest thinkers, anyway. He died in 1650.
1650.
So, right there in the middle of the 17th century.
Let me say one last thing, and this is I think a perfect segue. It's a background on the meditations. Yeah, the meditations where we'll see this argument play out of I think therefore I am, the very classic line. In this work, what he's trying to do is refute skepticism as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
There's a
Mm-hmm.
two parts of this book that we're going to take where he discusses the self. The first part is a case for skepticism. He wants to lay it out and as powerfully as he can in order to respond to it. After he does that, he attempts to prove things that he actually knows, the
Mm-hmm.
reliability of senses, memory, and then he goes to God and he tries to prove the existence of God. What we see is probably a stronger account of skepticism. He lays out a really powerful account of skepticism with not as much of a powerful account of refuting skepticism. And
Mhm.
that's why we tend to focus on the first half of this. So would you like to lead us?
So the book that Andrew's referencing is the First Meditations on Philosophy. Is that the title? First Meditations on Philosophy?
No, that's right. Meditations and First Philosophy. Yeah.
So I think there's 6 meditations in there, which you can think of them as chapters. So the first 2 meditations are the ones that will be referenced most often in classrooms or studies about consciousness or studies about the self. His justifications of the existence of God is also an important part if you're studying philosophy of religion. That comes in sections 5 and 6. But like Andrew said, there's this phrase. It's probably the most well-known quote in all of philosophy. People who know nothing about philosophy know this quote, and it's "I think, therefore I am." And this is the
This is the biggest bombshell of the
this
last,
is the bombshell, right? We'll call it that. This is the bomb drop. I don't know. Anyway,
the mic drop. Yeah.
the mic drop. Yes. Anyway, I think, therefore I am is so incredibly significant in philosophy that philosophers have been grappling with it ever since Descartes said it. So let's talk about why that's important in terms of the context of the self. In the first and second meditation, we find Descartes. He's questioning his senses. He wants to know, like, is there one thing, just one thing that I can be certain of? And he goes through this whole process of, he talks about his senses and why he doubts his senses, that senses are able to produce or bring us to truths. Of course, with senses, we're talking about things like vision, our 5 senses, vision, taste, smell, all that sort of stuff. That those are unreliable. And he even imagines himself in the second meditation. This is a famous part that people nowadays call Descartes' demon, but he envisions himself kind of Matrix-esque. He says, my body could be somewhere else, and a demon is manipulating my thoughts. What I'm experiencing as far as living, it could be completely false. I can't know that because this could be a possibility. So then he arrives, he's like, well, okay, if all of my existence could possibly be an illusion, what is the one thing that I can be certain of? And he arrives at this conclusion: I can be certain of the fact that I'm thinking about that all of my life could be an illusion. And so we get to I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum.
This is an interesting little fact that in the meditations on which you laid out great, he says not cogito ergo sum in meditations. He says, I am, I exist,
Uh-huh.
which I think is even more relevant for our discussion here.
Mm.
I am, I exist. And
Yeah.
keep going. I'm sorry I interrupted you
No, no,
here.
no, no, no. I think, therefore I am comes from Discourse on Method, I believe, which came out before this book, which came out before Meditations. But yeah, when and a little further in the second Meditations, he says, I am, I exist, but what kind of thing? I just said a thinking thing. So when he says thing, we're talking about the essence of what a human is. And when we say the essence of what a human is, we're often talking about the self. And so in a way, we can replace where he says thing with self. I am, I exist. But what kind of self? I just said a thinking self. Now, whether he meant that or not is kind of irrelevant, because what philosophy does with it and society in general does with it is they take it and interpret it the way that I just did. And there develops this theory that today is called Cartesian dualism, that the mind and the body are separate, and separate substances, in fact, that there is the material and then there's non-material, and that somehow this consciousness, this mind, this thing that we're calling the self, which is immaterial, can interact with that which is material, the brain. In philosophy, this is called the interaction problem. How can something non-material interact with something that's material? But all that aside, the significant thing for our discussion today about the self is suddenly, well, not suddenly, but now modern society begins to think of their mind as something separate from their body. And that mind is the thing that is the self. The body, kind of like a machine, a vessel that's carrying along our consciousness. And in fact, Descartes uses machine imagery in some of his other works, especially when he's talking about animals, non-human animals. He uses a parrot. I remember talking about it, how a parrot, a parrot, not a parent, a parrot, mechanically. I'm sure everyone was really excited about tropical parrots at the time because they're so exotic, coming over from the New World. But you could teach this macaw to say hello, or whatever, and Descartes like, this bird is not saying hello. It's just a machine that's
right.
that's mimicking what humans mean when they say hello. So anyway, the human body is seen as more so a carrier, if you will. There is interaction, of course, between the physical and the non-physical. Like, you can't deny that. Clearly, brain states impact our mind, our consciousness, and how we perceive things. But that's the big shift. We become an I, like a capital I. The self becomes an I. And that I is an individual thing.
That's right. And I'm going to paraphrase this passage. He talks about, I think, therefore I am, in three books, essentially. He talks about it in Discourse on Method. He talks about it in Meditations on First Philosophy, and then finally in Principles of Philosophy. I think the one that can best explain it is the final one, Principles on Philosophy. And I'm going to just paraphrase this paragraph just to show the brutality of this, almost. And I'm going to paraphrase it because it's a little complicated, but I'll paraphrase it. It says, while we can, if we're skeptics, reject anything which we have even the smallest doubt about, we can reject the existence of God, of the sky, of our bodies, even of our hands and our feet, and even our own body, not to think about bodies of other people. But we can't doubt the existence of the thing which is thinking of these things, because we can't be thinking that these things could not exist and think that the thing that's thinking of these things could not exist. Accordingly, the knowledge, I think, therefore I am, is the first and most certain that occurs to one who philosophizes orderly. So the first principle of thinking is, I think, therefore I am. And I think the point you make is fantastic. This is the mic drop. I am the only thing that exists. My body, I don't know. But me, myself, that is what exists. That's the only thing I'm certain. It flips the world on its head. I don't know if you exist. I don't know if anyone exists, really.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
that should change how we think about the world. If it should. It should.
Yeah. In philosophy, it's called the problem of other minds. We can't prove, if you will, at least through Descartes' rubric, that Andrew, who I'm looking at on a screen here, actually exists. I can see his body, but that too might be an illusion. But even further, at least I can imagine his body, but his mind, I can't even see that. And so we get this whole, like, solipsism is not something that developed at this time, but it leads to that. And I guess that's why Descartes considered the founder of modern philosophy. It's not like all of a sudden everyone was like, oh no, the problem of other minds, solipsism, but it leads to those conclusions that come later.
Because it's the building point. It's the building point for everything. It's even for thinking about the self. This is now the building point. It's that first principle approach of me.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only thing I can have no doubt which exists. Even if I'm hooked up to a machine and, it's spinning something, even if I'm part of, I'm a speck of a larger body which exists, even if all of that, I can still be sure that I exist, that myself exists.
So about 100 years later, we have, a number of philosophers are dealing with this idea. John Locke in England is dealing with this in his essay on human understanding. We get into concepts of like what is the human when that person is born, blank slate theory versus embedded concepts in us. But to the north of John Locke in Scotland is the great skeptical philosopher David Hume. What a pain in the rear David Hume is. With every single theory that someone comes out with, he's trying to poke a hole in it,
That's
which
right.
is great. Which is great. We need David Humes. So the thing that he contributes to this idea of the self, which abstracts the self even further, which is really what I want to point out as far as this trajectory. In the ancient medieval time, there was this certainty that the self was a soul and the soul was immortal. Descartes takes this idea and abstracts it a bit, abstracts the self from the body, or rather separates the self from the body, which results in abstracting the self. We're not as certain as before. And Hume takes that a step further and so abstracts the self that we have to question whether or not the self even exists, or if it does exist, in what way. So the thing I want to talk about Hume is what's called bundle theory, that human beings are nothing more than a bundle of perceptions. That's the famous line, a bundle of perceptions. So what the bundle theory of perception is very simply when we talk about like what is consciousness, what is the mind, what is the self, that thing that we consider reality, the movie show, the 3D bright color movie show that's going on in our head right now, this conscious experience we're having, and this conscious experience is in some ways the self. That conscious experience that we're having is nothing more than sensory input. That's it. And so if you're sitting there or you're walking or you're working in the kitchen or you're driving, you can think about all the sensations you're having right now, the data input that is going into your brain from sensory data, all that is happening right now. You're feeling temperature, you're experiencing different degrees of light on a particular spectrum. You're hearing certain things. So all you are is all of these perceptions that you're having. And so what Hume says is the brain takes those perceptions and organizes it in a way that makes our experience cohesive. But that cohesive experience is just nothing more than our sensory data, our sensory input being organized by our brain.
That's right. I want to contrast this view with the Aristotelian, Augustan, Thomistic account that's been underlining for the past 1500 years of philosophy. And this is the idea of properties, which we've talked about. I forget the one that we usually use, but I think when we talked about it, when we were first starting this podcast, I used an example of a car. We could say, okay, what are the properties of a car? But let's take it back to the human. What would you say the properties of the self are that make someone unique to
Mm-hmm.
to itself? The difference here, as you point out, and I just want to highlight this because it's so important, what is holding it all together? The
Mm-hmm.
properties of someone, not of not of you as having brown hair and blue eyes. No, what are the properties of you? We could. Who's the comedian who we make fun of sometimes with Jack Symes? Adam Sandler.
Oh, Adam Sandler.
Let's think about him for a second. What makes Adam Sandler Adam Sandler? We could say, he's very funny, debatably. I don't know what else we could say. But for Aristotle or someone who follows in his lineage, what he would say is that what makes him him is the soul. In all of the properties which are unique to him, which make him him, are bound up by that soul, not the brain, but this immortal soul which will carry on after. And this is why he's so concerned with virtue and vice and how vice will make that thing worse, because it would accumulate some of these properties, blah, 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 blah. For Hume, it's different. The thing holding it together is the brain, which probably will end one day. And so it's less concerned with eternal properties or even metaphysical properties like goodness or truth or things like this. It's
Hmm.
as you said, the thing that it's concerned with is sensory sensory properties,
Hmm.
sensory properties, and the implications of this are wide ranging, as I'm sure we'll talk about. But the fact that we are a unified, enduring thing is becomes way more complex because
Yes.
it will start to extend to things like psychology. Sociology is going to become a thing now, and our influence of the self. So it becomes a lot more complicated.
And that's the trajectory that I'm talking about when we go from ancient all the way to like current day. So with Hume, when we talk about that sensory input that you're talking about, and like what is the self? So here's an example. Students always ask, like, okay, bundle theory, I kind of get it. It makes sense. We're experiencing things all the time, and that's basically sensory data. How does that become a me? How does that become a self, an I, that Descartes talks about? I use an example of a storm because that's something that we're all familiar with, and organizing principles of the brain. So imagine yourself, Andrew, standing in a field, and suddenly you feel a change in temperature. You feel wetness, and you observe that this wetness is falling from the sky. And you observe that the sky, which is its own concept, by the way, you observe that the sky is gray and dark, like the light has grown darker. And you feel a change in temperature. Perhaps you feel wind. Wind is now blowing your hair, and you're observing all the grass around you blowing as well. And then you see flashes of light in the gray. So what your brain does is it takes all of that sensory data, puts it together, and says storm. Right? In modern psychology today, we'd call that schema theory, but that
Yep.
term didn't exist for Hume. The brain is organizing this sensory input into a way that creates a cohesive experience that we're all familiar with, that we can all share in. That's something we call a storm. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. That's a great.
So think about our brains doing this constantly throughout our conscious experience, like second by second, which is really interesting to think. That's what bundle theory is. And I think there's some implications that come out of this in terms of how philosophers view the self. What is the self?
It's a great example that you bring up. One way this changes how we think about ourselves and other people. I think this will sound kind of weird at first. I don't know how to put this. This is very complicated. One way that we can think about how this changes thinking about the self and others too is, as we mentioned earlier, probably less as a whole. And I think it deifies the self in a way. It makes the self a lot less special.
Hmm.
If we're just a bundle of nerves and perceptions, I think is kind of his point here. And I think he says that. I think that's the famous line from this, that the self and others are nothing but a bundle of nerves and connections. Brings us
Mm-hmm.
down a level, doesn't make us as special. And I think that's irked some thinkers and philosophers for a number of ways. But I think it also changes the self in how we become, how we become something. And this is a problem in philosophy that did exist, but it really will exist greater. Okay, what does that mean? How do we become ourselves? Well, it will depend a lot more now on what we see, who we're around, the experiences that we have. We can
Mm-hmm.
craft these experiences to become who we are and what we consume, not, of course, although perhaps physically, but also just in the world around us. Perhaps before we have a bit more natural traits, which tend to make us natural traits, of course, not meaning natural in our bodies, but pulls of our souls, which were of our selves which drag us to want to experience certain things, these kind of go away or are explained by natural features of our biology.
Mm.
So these are two initial points. First is this total dependence upon biology for thinking about ourselves. And second, we get a different explanation on how we become who we are.
Yeah, that's right, Andrew. And as we continue following this new scientific way of viewing the human body, and by extension, consciousness, which is by extension the self, we can go all the way up to modern time. Certainly, philosophers will argue against this quote, but Francis Crick, who was the person who came up with the double helix DNA, a very respected scientist, said, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." That's 350 years or so after David Hume. But again, when we talk about following this trajectory of thought, right, of how the self is conceived, we end up at this place in the 20th century where Francis Crick does say something like this. And when you say, Andrew, that the self becomes less special, I think this is how. And so in Hume's day, we say we're a bundle of perceptions. Okay. Well, at least our brain is organizing those perceptions into something cohesive that we can call a self. Well, you look at Francis Crick, and it's about as dim a conception of the self as you can think of. So those are really what I would say are the implications, the further implications of Hume's theory. Hume was an empiricist, and so it's no surprise that this is his view. John Locke was also an empiricist, and John Locke, you mentioned experience, Andrew. John Locke says that we become who we become based on our experiences that we have as we're growing up, as we're developing. And so where you're born and who you're born to, and all of this can become very important, and what types of lessons and values you're taught, etc., becomes very, very important in terms of who you are as a self versus an ancient or medieval conception of a self, whereas the self just is. It's you, essentially, and you're an immortal soul. Now the self is something that develops over time from experiences, which ultimately come from sensory information. So that's how I say, like, the self becomes abstracted. That's what I mean. I said that earlier. That's what I mean by the self becomes abstracted. You might say, like, the ancient conception of the self is abstracted. It's an essential you that really doesn't have a whole lot of features, frankly, but it's your soul, and it's going to go on. That in itself might be viewed as abstract, but it was certain. Now the certainty is gone. It's the experiences you have that creates you, the self, and there's nothing certain in that at all.
That's absolutely right. And the point here is that the self is no different from the body. And let me give a quick example. I just really want to highlight this point because it's the essential point here. For Hume, the self is just anything else in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, if we look at an apple, or sure, let's go with an apple. I think that's the classic example. The predecessing philosophers, the thinkers that we've talked about, when they look at this apple, they would say that it has properties. The properties exist as it's a substance. What are the properties of, like, an apple? I don't know. It's green. It's tangy a little bit, juicy when you cut into it. The things that make it an apple is because it has all of these properties. How do these properties exist? Well, it's just it's not there temporally, although the thing that combines all of these things is not there temporally, but it's existing metaphysically. It's kind of bound by these concepts together. And if you take one away, it just does not exist anymore. It doesn't exist. If you take away the greenness of a green apple, it's not a green apple anymore. For Hume, the apple is, it's a green apple because it's bound by the chemicals or whatever I don't know science of the greenness because it reflects a certain color, and the juiciness because on the table right now in front of me there is there's some thing in it which is making it juicy. My lack of science is really killing me here. And all of these things combined, the juiciness, the reflection of the greenness, and this was what makes it an apple because it has all of these things which bind it together, which make it green. This is complicated, but I'm using this to show there's no difference between that bundle of all of these things between this apple and the self. Not the body and the self are the same. It's all of these nerves and all of these endings. That's what makes the self the self. The same as the apple. It's just a bundle of nerves and, properties. And well, I don't want to say the word properties because that's probably not right, but the bundle of all of these physical features which make the apple are the same, which make the self the self. It's still physical properties. That's probably been made clear, but I just want to make it clear again.
And it shows how this modern conception of the self comes about. There's a question when it comes to Hume, there's a question as to whether or not he believed in a soul. Because this was still a very popular idea. I mean, the idea of a soul doesn't go away just because we're talking about bundles of perceptions and the mind is separate from the body. Descartes was a Catholic. Hume, it's hard to say what Hume was. Somewhat agnostic. He certainly dealt with religion a lot in his philosophy. Does he believe that there's a soul? And is that even an important question anymore in modern philosophy? Well, it is, but it becomes more difficult to talk about because now we're conceiving of the self as biologically produced.
That's right.
And also, I don't know when the idea of consciousness came about in the history of Western thought. Consciousness as we think of it today, scientifically as well as philosophically. I don't know when that became a common thing that people referenced. But I would say today, when we talk about self, soul, and consciousness, these three things get conflated in a lot of ways. And that for religious adherents, a big question is my consciousness my soul? Because this is kind of a shift that happens in the modern era, that this thing that we call mind that is separate from the body, if you want to believe in a soul, like of course so many, it's not like Christianity went away or something in the 17th century. The question is like, well, okay, the mind is separate from the body, so does this mean that the mind, consciousness, is the soul? And if the soul migrates from the body after death, is it consciousness that migrates with it? Or is consciousness the soul? So these ideas of self, soul, consciousness, body, just becomes very complicated
That's right.
in the modern era, especially
That's
late
right.
modern.
We'll see in the next episode how this idea continues and it's
Mm-hmm.
strung through the line. Now, that's not to say, and we'll be looking at this through the existentialists. That's not to say, even though we're looking at existentialists next time, that there's not thinkers who are continuing to develop Hume and Descartes and ancient Greek and medieval thoughts around the self. That these still are occurring, and there are still arguments to be made today. So I don't want to say that these have been completely dropped by the wayside or whatever. They're still going on, but
Absolutely.
I think that Hume and with the existentialists that they're definitely intertwined, although not maybe not completely, but they Hume sets the foundation for sure. And I think that really this is the preceding narrative among, lay people today, people who are just, probably for the most part, I would assume, maybe not. But I think that it's a very compelling theory about the self.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, with our existentialists next week too, it'll be interesting. We're going to look at two specifically, Kierkegaard and Sartre. And
great.
Kierkegaard was unquestionably a Christian, so would certainly believe in the idea of an immortal soul. yet so wrapped up in this idea of experience. And Sartre, on the other hand, is an atheist. He doesn't believe in the idea of a soul at all. But yeah, they both fall under this umbrella of existentialism and how that explains the self. So I think that'll be interesting to take a look at next week.
Yeah, that'll be a lot of fun.
Well, okay. Are we done? I think we're done.
All right, I guess we're done.
Okay, everyone. Thanks for listening. We always appreciate that you do. Go out there and give us a rating. Follow our show. Smash that subscribe button.
Subscribers on YouTube, so we'd love to see you there. And give our videos a like and subscribe to us there. But of course, you can always listen to us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. But make sure to follow us there so you can get updates for new episodes.
That's right. And contact us as well. Let us know what you think of the episode. You know, it's no fun to think that everyone, all the data that we get in terms of listeners is just bots, you know. So give us a contact. We're around on Instagram. Certainly you can contact us through YouTube. We have an email, contact@opendoorphilosophy.com. Give us a shout. Let us know what you think of the show, what you think of this particular episode, ideas for maybe future episodes, questions that you have about philosophy, or just say, hey, you guys are great.
We love when you say hey.
We do. Okay, I guess that's it. Okay, well, everyone, hope you're doing all right out there. And remember, when your life is in need of some philosophy, the door's always open.
Woot woot.
See ya.